I think it also shows just how differently these vaccines and, and all of the treatments and the disease itself impacts people disproportionately and in different ways as well. And, if you look at the cases and who they've really impacted, how are you trying to also, and you mentioned a little bit about boosting the confidence here behind the vaccines, but in general, how are you tackling the inequities around vaccine distribution, the treatment of this disease? As we know, there's so much sort of systemic issues and racism that is embedded in the healthcare system.
Well, you just asked the $1 million question right there. California has taken a very thoughtful and strategic approach to addressing equity. And it starts by recognizing that these inequities didn't just come out of nowhere, right? It's not that like COVID vaccine came the COVID pandemic came in at the beginning of last year and brought with it all of these inequities. They were already existing, and they manifest in what we see in the differential rate of infection and death among our vulnerable communities. And so we recognize in order to respond to that, we need to tackle some of these inequities using a multi-pronged strategy. So in California, when we looked at our vaccine strategy, we took a 5-pronged approach, including allocation. So allocating vaccine in proportion to disease burden. We see higher rates of disease and death in our most vulnerable communities. And so we are sending higher numbers of vaccines to those vulnerable communities to proportionally target that risk. But sending vaccines to vulnerable communities alone is not going to solve the problem, right? So we need to address the issues of trust that have developed over decades. And in order to do that, we need to work with trusted messengers and arm them with the resources to be able to connect individuals with vaccines. But on top of that, we need the provider network, right? We recognize that in our vulnerable communities, there are fewer healthcare providers. And so we need to make sure that we have enough vaccinators in our vulnerable communities. And then on top of that, we got to address misinformation. So we have to have a public education strategy. And the final piece, which is critically important, is that we have to track all the data and continue to course correct as we go along, because addressing issues of equity is not something that is simple or that is going to be overcome overnight, but it requires a dedicated commitment and it requires resources. And that is what California has been putting behind this effort.
Well, so let's start with the charging stations. You want to build, I believe, 500,000 around the country. But the question is, should the taxpayers fund that if not everyone's going to be driving an electric car immediately?
Well, so the idea here is to use federal investment to kickstart the development of these charging stations. We don't envision them as all being purchased, owned, and operated by the federal government. But we do know that we have to make some what I would call market-making investments to really help deploy these at scale and to get them out across different kinds of communities and areas, because there are some where we still don't have the density of electric vehicles in rural areas or along highways. But we're starting to be able to better and better map out where we most need these charging resources. In fact, this week, our Federal Highway Administration put out the latest round of information on the alternative fuel corridors that were designated as part of what it'll take to really get these from being not just a bunch of dots on a map, but a true national network. And we just don't think that'll happen without federal support.
Okay, and you also talked about the consumer incentives, trying to make these vehicles more affordable. There have been some federal tax credits, $7,500 but there's been a cap on those. And essentially they've helped to, subsidize the purchase of EVs by people who might have been early adopters anyways and might have purchased that. So the question is, would you extend those or increase the amount to make that EV purchase affordable to people like you and me?
Well, the tax credits, the original program certainly had a big impact in driving the adoption of these technologies and helping that U.S.-based industry pick up. But as we look to the future, again, this can't be a luxury item. Indeed, it's often those who are under the most pressure in terms of their family transportation budget who have the most to gain by the fuel savings that are going to come about. So as we get into more detail in the policy design about how to deploy these funds, it's absolutely going to be done in a way that's really for everybody, not just for a few. After all, the vision is for this to very much be the future of how our cars work writ large.
Yeah, so the dust is kind of settling on the big White House International Climate Summit last week. And at that event, we saw some really aggressive, but also non-binding commitments from a lot of very large emitting countries, including the US, but others as well. And so I'd like to ask kind of what's the road ahead for translating those aggressive and ambitious commitments and targets into very sort of tangible on-the-ground efforts, both in the US, but globally as well?
Great. Well, that's a great question. And thank you so much. I think this is a really, as you're right, the dust has settled. And it was a great sort of cap to Earth Week and an Earth Day for this new administration. And we had just a lot of action happen over those 2 days from both the private sector and public sector and countries around the world. So really, I think the hard work begins today. As we start the week, it really is about turning a lot of those commitments to action, particularly those that are going to be announcing new NDCs by the climate conference in November of this year. How do we work with those countries bilaterally, but also multilaterally to get us on track to make sure that we leave Glasgow ensuring that we are able to keep global temperature rise at 1.5 degrees Celsius and to preserve the ability for us to maintain that coming out of Glasgow. It's a real key target for us. And it's also what the science requires.